Hello and welcome to the 2015 State of Black America web series. I'm your moderator, Shannon Lanier. Every year, the National Urban League releases its highly anticipated report on the state of Black America. The report has become the national touchstone for social and economic status of African American and Hispanic communities. Now, this year's report, Save Our Cities, Education, Jobs, and Justice, addresses the crisis facing African Americans and other communities of color in education, employment, and justice. Now, each year we ask the same question: what is the state of Black America? Today, our esteemed panelists will answer that question as it relates to the Black church. Joining me are Only Love Austin, Executive Director of Pico Faith in New York, and Reverend Tony Lee, Senior Pastor of the Community of Hope AME Church. Welcome, everyone.
It was good to see you.
Good to see you.
Okay, so we have to start off with the question. You know, back in the day, everyone knew you go to church on Sunday. That's what you did. Mama got you up, you go to church. Now it seems like times have changed. Is the church still relevant in our community?
Well, and I think that, yes, the church is relevant. I think that what we're witnessing is a cultural shift, not just in a Black church, but in church in general. There's so many different kinds of options. We're watching also the growing up of the millennials, and so we're watching them kind of find their space in church and what that's going to mean for them. But if you look at the Black church, it still is as relevant as ever has been. The Black church has been a center of community, has been a center of fight and struggle, and if you look even now, that what you will find is the Black church is still standing up. It's still the place where generations of people come through to be able to be taken care of, to be nurtured, to grow. The Black church is still feeding. The Black church is still making moves in education. The Black church is still supporting and struggle. And so I would say the Black church is relevant. The challenge is the Black church is not necessarily its best PR firm. And so what happens is that oftentimes, because the church is the church doesn't feel it's necessarily supposed to sit and tell everybody about what it's doing. And so many people may not necessarily know all of the great work churches are doing, but it's my experience that churches all over this nation are doing amazing work in community with the least and the left out.
Well, Only Love, a lot of people, or many churches, have seemed to have a decline in congregation members. Why do you think that is?
Well, there's a couple of things that are impacting kind of congregational attendance in the Black community. One is that Black folks have more spiritual choices today. In New York, for instance, we have Black folks that are Muslim, that are Yoruba, that are Catholic, that are going to multiracial churches. For the first time in our American history, Black people have a great amount of spiritual agency. And so with that, you see Black people seeking out alternatives to the Black church. And then you also see a generational shift where you have the post-civil rights generation who may have grown up without going to church. So I was one such young person where my mother was the first Black atheist I ever knew, and my dad was actually a 5%er, which is an offshoot of the Nation of Islam, but they did not impose their beliefs on me, but I started to read the Bible and pray at 10 years old myself, and then I entered the church, a Baptist church in my community, at 14. And so I remember what it is to be outside of the Black church and then to be very entrenched in it. And the Black church, you know, nurtured me as someone who was in foster care, as someone whose family experienced homelessness. And so I'm eternally grateful to the church, but also there was tension for me being a young person from East New York, Brooklyn, one of the communities that sends the most people to prison in New York City, and wrestling with being a part of the hip hop generation, but wanting to be a part of the church. But when we would do outreach in the community, the outreach would stop at the housing projects because the elderly, with good reason, were afraid during the crack epidemic to go into the housing projects. And so we have these tensions where in many cities, the Black church is now attended by those who are commuting. So they used to live in the neighborhood, and then as we got greater economic opportunities, we moved to other places. So there's many things impacting the attendance of the Black church, but for me, the most important question is, if your church closed its doors today, would anyone in the community know? And I think that's what we're struggling with even during this Black Lives Matter movement, where there was some tension between the younger generation and the older generation, which I spoke to leaders in the Black Lives Matter movement who said, we want to work with clergy. We just want to work with clergy of principle. So I think, as my Union Theological Seminary buddy said it's a PR issue, but it's also an issue of, is the Black church relevant to the spiritual needs we have today, where folks are questioning, where is the Black presence in the Bible? Part of my work is research around the Black presence in the Bible. How do I find a faith that isn't whitewashed? And the Black church did a great job during slavery of taking this faith and making it its own. And it should be noted historically, two of the earliest Christian countries were Nubia and Ethiopia. So we had a faith before we came here, but little facts like those have gotten lost.
Wow. So what can we do to get more people into the doors of the church?
Well, and I think it's important, even as we're having this conversation for me around whether people are coming to the Black church, to identify that actually there's a decline in churches in general. So it's not just kind of a Black church kind of a piece. And that's generational, that you're looking at major generational shifts and what that means. But one of the things that we are witnessing, if you look at the churches that are growing and flourishing all over the nation, is that they're doing the same things previous generation churches did. They're shaping ministries that really are connecting to the needs and the issues of the generations that we're facing right now. And I think, just in my experience and what I'm seeing, that in the midst of what we're seeing and some of the challenges about some of the decline nationally, just in general for churches, that we are seeing a shifting, a generational shifting in church, in which you are watching a newer generation, a younger generation coming up and finding their voice in church. And as the younger generation comes and finds their voice, then what you will see is they find their place in church. And I believe that we're seeing it, even in Black Lives Matter, that you saw a tension in Black Lives Matter, but you saw a tension in Black Lives Matter not just with the church. You saw a tension with civil rights organizations. You're seeing a similar tension generationally, even in corporations. So it's not just a Black church kind of attention. It really is that baby boomers, there are so many boomers, that baby boomers are still holding on for every bit of platform they have, while other generations are trying to find their space. And what I believe is, as we continue to see this transition, that we'll continue to see a place of relevance for young brothers and sisters.
But it used to be that the church was the head of those social movements. They were out there on the front line. Do you think that's declined as well? And if so, why? And what can we do to get back on the front line?
Well, I think it's a both and, because as a faith-based organizer with the PICO Network, which is the largest faith-based organizing group in the country, we see congregations of all faiths, including historically Black churches, that are on the front lines in the community. Just this year, through the advocacy of churches, 4 million people have seen an increase in their wages and benefits. And so each day I see clergy who are on the forefront of fighting for economic justice, and that's from all traditions. But I also have to say that there has been a decline in the Black church's prophetic witness. It hasn't died out, but during the years when prosperity gospel was being preached a great deal, that led to some of the decline. Or theological shifts, where in the past, people saw their faith very much connected to the civil rights movement, but with the rise of the evangelical movement, which has impacted the entire American church, you even see Black folks now having the theology that, social justice is here, my faith is there. And so what's important is to uncover that from the Hebrew Bible to the New Testament, social justice is commanded throughout the scriptures, and to help bridge that theological gap, because we can't say that the Black church's prophetic witness is just as strong today as it was in the past. I do think there's been shifts and declines for many reasons, but some of those reasons are things we need to repent of. We were just this weekend with some of the leaders from Ferguson, some of the young leaders, and they did a training for over 100 New York City people of faith on how to engage with this movement. And they said, we believe in God, we just didn't go to church. And some of the clergy mistaken that. And some clergy, when they went to Ferguson, they actually repented, because they felt they had let the younger generation down in a certain way, sometimes being more concerned about sagging pants than the social conditions outside of the church. And that's not to bash the church, but I think we have to, have some tension and some honesty on some of the critiques.
And I also think that in the midst of the critiques, which are valid, I also think, though, that we do not need to glorify or bring some kind of false glorification of the civil rights movement and the church during the civil rights movement, everybody didn't march with King.
It was only about 4%.
Right. So everybody talks as if the church, everybody was marching with King, everybody was arm in arm. They talk like they did now. But back then, everybody didn't march with King. And really, it was a percentage, it was a portion of the church that really stood there in the midst of it all. And so I think it's also very important, because when you understand that, then you can be able to look at even now, and you can see that while we may not be where we want to be, that we do have a lot more going on than we actually may think we have going on, because we've got this glorified notion of the black church during the civil rights era, that every church was there marching and all those kinds of pieces. But when we really look at it, I believe that we may be farther along than we are, while we still have ways that we need to go. So there's always a need to push ourselves forward in prophetic witness. But sometimes it's very easy to bash the church for what it's not, without understanding kind of where it is.
So what are some of the programs you guys, go ahead. You could,
Just because I understand that only about 4 or 5% of black churches stood with King in the civil rights movement, but I still think publicly the black church has been a barometer, and the black community has been kind of a spiritual barometer for this country, whether it's from abolition to the civil rights movement, meaning that our struggle for freedom has always caused America to challenge the notion of who's a citizen. And I think the church played a key role in that. I think the church is still doing a great deal today. I work with 70 churches across the city that are dedicated to justice. So I'm not one to bash the church, but I think we have to look at some serious things that have been occurring. You know, millions of dollars are collected in offerings every weekend. But
so
yet,
what do you think the church should be doing with that money and with their power and their voice that they do have to affect social change and economic development within their church? What are some things they could do?
So I think around economic development, there are many different ways in which people can, if just 10% of black people who went to worship somewhere every weekend moved off of the pews and into public life, we could radically change this country. One, for instance, we're working with clergy across America, many who are formerly incarcerated, to call for an executive order to ban the box on job applications that asks about being formerly incarcerated. Prison Fellowship is an evangelical ministry that was a prison ministry, and they started to see there are more people entering prison. We have to work on policy. So Prison Fellowship was able to get Walmart, Walmart, who has had a lot of employment issues, to actually ban the box. And they were able to get Target, 2 multi-million-dollar companies. And this was just a small group of evangelicals. And I believe there are many issues that the black church, we could just choose an issue, such as reentry. Now that we're in this new Jim Crow, what can we intentionally do to welcome these people back? Now, there's individual projects going on, like our Live Free campaign, healing communities, but I still think that there are a good amount of churches that think that all that is important is what happens on Sunday, and not realizing that Monday is sacred as well.
Okay. Do you have any suggestions before we close?
Well, a couple of things. Some of the things that we've seen, say, with the Proctor Conference and the work they're doing on the prison industrial complex, in which they really have helped shape not just what churches can do, but curriculum to help empower churches. If you look at the work that Baldwin Gilead is doing around HIV and AIDS in many of the churches, or even the work that NAACP is doing around HIV and AIDS with churches, has been significant. If you look at, say, in the D.C. area, there's a consortium of churches that are working around violence, and the violence is happening in the D.C. area. That I believe that we have these kinds of examples all over the nation, even in the work in Prince George's County, in which we've been seeing churches that have been working not just around the Black Lives Matter, but working also in partnership with the police department and the state's attorney around Black Lives Mattering, as well as around domestic violence. I believe that all over the nation that we see these kinds of pieces, not necessarily looking at the church, black church as kind of a monolithic kind of an organization that has this kind of top-down structure in which everybody just kind of answers to one leader and everything happens, But we can look, I believe, at a lot of different examples of work that a black church is doing that I think can be brought to scale, that I think that as we sit and we look at and we look at some of the great work that's happening in some areas, that we can look at models that can be replicated in other areas, that we can help to show people in other areas what's needed to be able to move forward. But I think that we do have some of the models. I think it really is how do we share some of the models so that places that don't have the models can help to bring them to scale in other areas.
And then I would also add, how do we create churches that welcome all, from all economic statuses, whether they're a returning citizen or someone who's never been to prison. Many young people have expressed that they don't always feel welcome in our churches, and I just want to be honest and transparent about that. I also want to lift up that one area that the black church can start to focus on is the incarceration of women. So we are starting to focus on what has been happening to black men, and I think that work should continue. But we should all know that the fastest growing group entering prison for the first time are black women of childbearing age. Then according to the Pew Research Center, the average Christian in the world today is a woman of African descent. And so the black church in America really needs to realize that the average Christian, the Christian church in general, the average Christian today, which is a woman of African descent in America, is also the person entering prison for the first time at the highest rate. And Villanova University recently published research that showed that darker skinned women receive 12% longer sentences than their lighter skinned counterparts, and that darker skinned girls are 3 times more likely to be suspended than their lighter skinned counterparts. And so some of these issues of sexism and colorism that the black church has not always wanted to address is staring us in the face through the new Jim Crow. And I would just encourage our churches, which are predominantly powered by women, to really pay attention to the fact that while they're getting the black men through the front door, they've been getting the sisters through the back door. And who's going to run the church when a whole generation of women have been incarcerated?
Wow, all great points. Thank you both for joining this conversation. And now we need you to join this conversation also. Please share this web series on your social media to all your friends, family, and followers. And let's continue this solution session using the hashtag #SaveOurCities. Please go get involved. The State of Black America web series has been presented by AT&T. Thank you, AT&T, for your continued support of the National Urban League. We would also like to thank Comcast for their production support of the State of Black America web series. Together, we are empowering communities and changing lives. Now, don't forget to follow me on social media at Mr. Shannon Lanier and at Arise TV 360. And for more information on the State of Black America and to purchase the book, visit the National Urban League at www.stateofblackamerica.org.